Let's see, to introduce my journey, it's been quite an interesting one. So I like to say that when I was growing up, I always preferred math and art as my two favorite subjects, and those are not quite compatible. And I also was very interested in computers. The internet was becoming a thing back then. I'm not that old, but somehow technology moves fast. And so yeah, so I eventually learned about computer science when I was in high school, and so that's when I came to Center to study, and I ended up double majoring in math as well because I always loved it. Um, but I didn't quite forget about my art. It was, that's why I wanted to go to liberal arts college, was to be able to keep that awake and take my other classes that really kept that interest alive in me. I also worked at CTL. I don't know if CTL is still around, hopefully. Center for Teaching and Learning. It was in the basement of the library. Yeah. Worked there all 4 years as a student worker and learned about using Mac computers and helping people, which is another passion of mine, and how we use technology to really solve problems. So I went to grad school at Purdue University in computer science to get my master's. And while I started as PhD, eventually left as my master's, decided that was more aligned with my interests, but did human computer interaction as my master's. And that started my pathway into the UX design world. So it's really combining psychology and computer science. And you're kind of learning about, and sometimes as computer scientists, we can get really focused on wanting to do the most efficient code possible for sometimes, but when a user is using that software, they may not notice that extreme speed depending on what it is. If you're doing a mobile app, for example, that might have effect. But so the human computer interaction is we're able to start making judgment calls on, hey, if the eyes cannot literally process that extra speed, then we don't need to spend as much time in the development world doing things. So there's just some things like that to learn. But so I started my career in Washington, D.C. at Booz Allen Hamilton, which is a management consulting firm and also technology consulting. Consulting is a really good fit for me. I've mostly stayed in that world, but there I was basically an HCI software engineer. So UX was still kind of new and not a lot of understanding of it. And so I was working on the front. I was more so a front end developer, really working on what's the design of the screen, but coding that in JavaScript and even still having to code all the way down to the database because I was technically a full stack engineer, is what it's called sometimes. But really wanted to focus on that front end even more. And there wasn't a lot of opportunities at that job specifically to like really hone my UX skills. So I went to Deloitte. There's kind of a startup within Deloitte called Deloitte Digital. And it's much bigger now, but at the time there was only 20, 30 of us, but I think there's hundreds now. But yeah, so that's when I really was a pure UX designer, learned much more of the skills, and you learn the differences between how to design a Android app versus an Apple app, a responsive website, which means a website that whether you view it on your phone or on the computer or on a tablet, it will adjust to your screen. So learned those. But there, it was a good place to learn skills, but I realized it was harder for me to really get to the meat of the problems. I liked solving user problems, and that's really the heart of UX work is we want to solve problems through design. And it can be missing sometimes, to be honest, especially in the agency world, because it's a lot of times you're catering to clients on clearly I have an opinion, but catering to clients on they're saying, hey, I want to build this app, make it pretty. And UX is really not about making pretty. It's more about actually solving real problems. Yes, the design is like the last 15% of our work, and that is pretty, hopefully, but it's there's a lot that goes into it to make that happen. So then I decided to do some design thinking training, which is basically learning more about the design process and really how do you discover the real problems that users are having in the real world. Maybe not even with software in general, just like problems people are facing. And then how can you go through a process to learn, um, what really these problems, get them defined really well. And then eventually you start trying out different design ideas and concepts and you test those with folks really early. We call them wireframes, and they're just sketches that you can literally do on paper. We can do them in technology, doesn't matter. But just to get some feedback on these ideas. Are we going in the right direction? And we can keep testing, design a little more, test a little more, design a little more, test a little more, and to make sure we're coming up with the right design at the end of the day that will actually solve a problem. So for example, if users say their problem is, hey, I can't make a decision without this very specific information, no matter how pretty the design is, if the design doesn't have that specific piece of information, it's not useful. So that's what we work to do and solve problems around that. Yeah, so with design thinking training, I left agency. I went to work for industry, healthcare, and ended up, I was a lab work. So I think if you need to go get a blood test, for example, the problems we discovered were that folks didn't want to have to go to their doctor to ask for things like a vitamin D test. Like, I just want to get a vitamin D test. I don't need my doctor to approve for that. So we ended up making it so that people could, on their own, go straight to the lab and say, hey, I just want to do a vitamin D test, skip the doctor. And of course, we had to follow HIPAA and make sure we're all compliant with healthcare regulations and all that. But it was a really cool, opened the door for people to get testing they need, and even more private testing. Like if they wanted to do an STD test, for example, they don't have to go through their doctor. They could just get the test done and keep it private to themselves. We didn't do things like, cancer screening or anything. It was just more things that the doctors were okay just saying, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, and then after that, I decided, hey, it's time for me to start trying to work on building my own team. So I went to, still in healthcare, I went to travel nurse agency in industry, and then was the very first UX person there, introducing the company to what does UX mean, doing a lot of education of the stakeholders, all the C-suite, and teaching them what the value is and how it can make an impact on the company and return on investment, all these things that stakeholders like to hear. And yeah, so I went from being one single person to eventually 6 UX, both researchers and designers. And I forgot to mention, I've really specialized on the research side of things at this point. So I'm not in design as much. I'm spending a lot of times with people, interviewing them, talking about what their problems are, and wrapping that up in a way that, if you talk to 10 people, you start to figure out what the themes are, and then passing that over to the designers, to our stakeholders, to managers, to really understand. We call them customer insights of what can we do to solve these problems. And then I help orchestrate that through the business and help people really understand what our customers are saying. So I'm basically the voice of a customer inside a company now. Yeah, and I really enjoy managing a team. So that's been fun, and it's a new for me. And that's about where I am. So a long, kind of windy journey. I just really followed my passion of, I love helping people. I love solving problems. I love critical thinking. That's what I like to do. And even though I left Purdue not, getting a PhD, and it was very research focused, I ended up in the world of research anyway. So just following your passions. But I felt Center was really big on teaching us, and it's proved well for me. So, and I enjoy my work. So I will pass it to Eric. Thanks for listening to my long-winded story.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Brittany. I think you'll see a lot of sort of themes in our experiences, although I came from sort of the other end of the spectrum. So I graduated from Center in 1998, so it's been a few years. At that time, UX was not really a thing. And so I came into Center wanting to do biology and ecology because I like systems and I like sort of the physical, sort of like natural world. I started taking a couple of chemistry classes my freshman year, and I was like, I don't want to do this. This is not for me. So I pivoted and I started taking, I think I was taking an anthro class, and I ended up being a double major in cultural anthropology and philosophy. Because to me, it was a simple transition over because it was still systems thinking, but it was just around people instead of sort of biological systems, right, outside of humans. So that was really interesting. I think I took every anthro class that was offered at Center the time I was there and sort of exhausted the curriculum. And to me, that sort of anthropology background was foundational to everything that I've done. And so, like I said, when I was sort of graduated in 1998, there was not a lot happening in UX, and I didn't have any sort of background in design proper. So I sort of bounced around in my early 20s. I ended up in Boston, working for Cultural Survival, which is a quarterly journal put out by Harvard around the rights of indigenous peoples. And so that was just a volunteer job, but it used my degree. And so I was like, oh, I'm doing something. And it got me away from home. And so I ended up getting a job to pay the bills at the Harvard bookstore as a computer software buyer. So I would buy all the software that the Harvard students needed and sort of had to figure out, okay, what do they need and how, and sort of we collaborated with the MIT guy and sort of our different communities were different. And I didn't know this at the time, but that was really laying the groundwork for understanding who are the people that I'm serving and what are their needs and what do I need to do to meet their needs and be in service of their needs. I ended up moving to Michigan and I took a job as a assistant editor at the University of Michigan Press on their anthropology and political science list. Again, still not sure what I wanted to do. Ended up talking to someone that was taking some classes at the School of Information, which used to be the library science school. I was like, oh, this is super interesting. I can take everything I know about social systems and how people create meaning in their lives through interactions with other people and material culture. And I can take that research knowledge and all that sort of theory and apply it to building digital products. Oh yeah, that sounds interesting. That seems like something that I want to do. So I did a HCI degree, Human Computer Interaction, at the University of Michigan School of Information. I graduated from there in 2003. While I was there, I was working on with a research group there on what used to be called, what was it? It was CREW, so it's Collaboratory on Research on Electronic Work. It was all about sort of remote collaboration and how do we understand what do people need? Again, this was sort of early video conferencing and like, how do we, what's more important, the audio connection or the video connection in terms of making human relations? So we did some early work on that and sort of these large scientific collaborations. I ended up getting married. I met someone in grad school who was a social worker. We ended up getting married after grad school and moved to Maine. But I was still working with my research group, but that ended and then there was no work. It was like, there's no work in sort of this space in early 2000s in Maine. And so my information visualization professor from grad school connected me with a design consultancy in Pittsburgh called Maya Design. They're sort of still around, but they've been consumed by one of these large business management consultancies. So while I was there, we worked sort of in triads. So we was a human scientist, a researcher, with a visual designer and then an engineer on all of our consulting projects. And so I came in as a researcher based on my anthro background and my sort of degree in HCI. And we would work on projects and I'd just try to understand who are these people, what are their needs? And so we did everything from wearable computers for soldiers to, this was in the early days of e-commerce. And so we did a lot of research with Target to understand who are their consumers and how do they need to structure these early sort of e-commerce websites to meet the needs of their consumers. All sorts of different things when I worked there. And then I transitioned, well, during that time, it was like 2008 when the economy was in the shitter. There was huge layoffs. And so I got laid off. My wife was 8 months pregnant with our second child and no one in Pittsburgh was hiring, no one. And I realized, this was a huge realization for me, that I had invested all of my social energy into the company that I was working at, and now I got laid off and I had no connections. And so I started getting engaged with IXDA, which is Interaction Design Association. It's a professional association for interaction designers, which is sort of a subfield of this whole kind of UX space, because UX was still not really a predominant term at this time. And so I got involved with that. Then I ended up getting a job at another consultancy in Columbus, Ohio, which was focused primarily on research. So they did a little bit of design work and we were sort of building out their design capacity, but I was also doing research. And during my time at Maya, I had learned a lot of visual design and interaction design, just collaborating with colleagues and things. And so my career was starting to shift from just research to doing research and design work. But then I was in a design specific company. And so that started to get a little frustrating. So again, through my, and at that time in Columbus, I got engaged with the IXDA again, and I started becoming a local leader. So I would sort of run the local meetups. And I ended up starting a new software design consultancy in partnership with a studio that was in Boston through someone I had met on social media, right? And so this was the early days of Twitter. so I was sort of active on social media and sort of having these intellectual discussions and able to make connections with people. And so it was through some of those connections that I started this consultancy of my own. We did that for a couple of years, and it just never really took off because the kind of work we were doing wasn't really compatible with the clients and things in Columbus. And so all my clients ended up being on the East Coast or West Coast anyway. So long story short, we shut that down. I went independent at that point in time. But at that point, I was also on I don't remember all the timing, but I got deeply engaged with IXDA to the point where I was on the global board of directors, and then I was president of IXDA for 2 years at the end of my board term. And I also started, because I was involved with all the local leaders, I started up a regional design conference. So one of the things IXDA does is run a global, they just had it last week in Zurich, a global design conference. And so I would go to that every year. And then I started a regional one in the Midwest, and we sort of moved around from city to city. And that lasted for 10 years until COVID hit. And then we shut it down. But through all these different ways, I was meeting people and sort of being exposed to people and having these conversations outside of just the companies I was working at, which allowed me at that point to go independent. And so then I was an independent designer and researcher for about 8 years. And I did everything from research, trying to understand like what might new products be, a sort of generative research, to evaluative research in terms of we have this product or prototype, how does it work? How can we make it better? To doing actual then interaction design and UI design work on like, okay, we have this idea of what we think we want. Now let's actually make it real. And these are all mostly digital products, but sort of different levels of sort of screen-based digital products. So from there, then that brought me up to this last year, where actually I'm no longer independent. I took a job with a company called Aurora, which is a sort of large scale startup in the autonomous vehicle space. And so we're focused on autonomous trucking first. And it's been an interesting shift because now I'm no longer looking at sort of producing products for the general public, but a lot of the work that we're doing, at least right now, until we launch the product, is working with internal autonomy engineers and trying to understand what are their needs, and then developing better software for them to do their jobs. And so a lot of the stuff, most of the stuff that we're working on right now is all internal tools for engineers inside the company. And it's been a big shift sort of thinking about, okay, what are these, maybe the users are not thousands or hundreds of thousands of people in the public, but just like these 10 engineers. And what do they need to do their jobs better? And how do we sort of understand what information do they need? When do they need it? Maybe it's adjusting some of their process flows. Maybe it's adjusting some of the tooling. But that's been an interesting sort of shift for me to sort of think about that. Yeah, so I don't know. I think like summing up sort of my career and kind of what's been beneficial, I think it's been being open to changing and being sort of open to seeing what the world has to offer and taking advantage of that, and not waiting for someone to sort of have a job opportunity in front of you and you're just like, okay, I'll take that. So being curious, I think really like being interested in people. You have to be interested in people to do anything in sort of the UX space, because that's really all that matters, right? You can, yeah, it's related to technology and it's related to design, but it's really about what are people. I like to think about it in terms of materiality. And so when you're a designer, your material, depending on what kind of design you do or art you do, right? You might be a sculptor, and maybe your material is clay or glass or whatever, right? If you're an interaction designer, we sort of have two materials. One is kind of the technology that we sort of manipulate to do the things that we want to do, but the other material is people and human behavior, and really understanding what makes people tick and how are they going to react and respond to things. You really have to enjoy both of those, right? You have to enjoy some of the technology because you have to understand it to some degree, but you really have to understand and sort of enjoy people. And there's like, I still think the UX field is like, I actually don't use that term a lot, even though I named a conference after that term, but it's become so ubiquitous that it's really lost a lot of meaning. And so you can get a UX job, and then your friend can get another UX job, and you might be doing totally different things. And so you really have to be careful about what do you mean when you talk about UX. Working at a consultancy is different than working in-house somewhere. Working at a large company is different than working on sort of enterprise software is different than working on smaller scale stuff. There's kind of tangential areas like service design that are sort of very similar to UX, but it's kind of looking at kind of bigger picture, and you're not necessarily embedded with designing sort of digital touch points and stuff. You're sort of looking at the whole system. Anyway, so there's a lot of space to move and play, and you can do more research type of work and focus on that. You can focus on more design and front end work. I've done a lot of work sort of in between in the sort of space called information architecture, which kind of lives in between, right? Is you have to understand the people and what are their information needs, but then how do you, it's not about how do you visually present it necessarily, but how do you structure that information in different ways so that people can find things and people can find what they need, and using the right terms and language, right? So a lot of it's about language and how do we use language to express the things that we want to express so people can find them, right? But everything that we do is always in service of someone else's needs, right? Who are the people that we're serving? Who are the users? Who are the people that are buying our products? Who are the people that are using our software? And what do they need to do their jobs, or what do they need to live their lives? And then how do we do that? The other thing I missed, which is fine, I'll wrap up after this. Through all of the sort of interaction design stuff, I got connected with CIID, which is the Copenhagen Institute of Interaction Design, and I started teaching classes there about 5 years ago. They have essentially a master's degree program. It's a 1-year intensive program, and I teach the intro to interaction design class for them. And then they also have a bunch of like summer school pop-up classes. Their teachings, I was supposed to go, but our class didn't fill up in Italy next month. We would just go for a week and we sort of run through these kind of intense workshops for a week, kind of introducing these different topics to people and sort of working through actual examples with them. So that's been fun to sort of to shift away from some of the professional practice that I do to start teaching and doing some of that as well. But I'll stop talking there, and I don't know what's next. If we have questions, or I'll give it back to the host.
Yeah, no problem. So yeah, we're here for you guys. What questions do you have about UX careers?
Hi, sorry, I'm Braden Duncan. It was great to hear you all talk about the super interesting, specifically you, Mr. Dahl. My father's a truck driver, so I think that's really cool work. Slow down a little though, I got films today. No, one interesting thing that I heard you all like talk about that was interesting for me coming from a psychology major kind of standpoint is working with the people. Specifically like the groups of people you're working with. If you could speak on it, or if there's any differences maybe between like working for designing things for like the general public, aiming things at like broader clientele, broader customers, patients, things like that, versus designing things, working with teams to help like professionals or like those niche kind of situations, if there's a different way to approach that, or if you've had different experiences working with those two different like groups.
Yeah, I have a quick comment, and then Brittany, you can answer as well. I think one of the big differences that I've seen, particularly with research and design, when you're working on general public stuff, it's a lot easier to sort of use yourself as a proxy initially, or to then like as you come up with designs to grab. We used to just, I don't know, it's kind of insensitive, but we used to say like we just need a warm body to like view and vet this, right? We just need somebody, because this is like a general public type of thing, and anyone, it doesn't require special knowledge, it doesn't require special sort of needs or desires. We just need a human to sort of, can you interpret and understand this, right? With sort of basic kind of whatever general population kind of skill sets. But then when you start getting the specialties, you really have to like, who you recruit for your participants to do the research with is really important, because you're trying to understand a specific workflow or maybe something related to their occupation, right? And so you really need to understand what do they actually do. And I do a lot of field work, and so I go on site, not as much right now with the work I'm doing, but in the past, go on site and sort of watch people and observe them. And this is where a lot of my anthropology participant observation, we called it, where you're going and just like viewing them as the expert. And so you're trying to understand what's their worldview, they see the world, and how do they interpret things? What are their information needs? What do they have? What information do they need to do their jobs, and what's sort of their workflow, and sort of defining some of that. And then when you go and design and make something, putting it back in front of those specific people that have those specific needs and that specific knowledge, those are really the only ones that are going to give you viable feedback to critique your work and make it better. because you're working in a specialty type thing. And so you have to understand, is this sort of a general public type of thing where anyone can answer it, or I can run with it myself for a little bit before I need some feedback, or do I need to really understand a specialized area of operation and get very specialized feedback in terms of the information that's being displayed, right? Are you trying to make some decision based on a couple metrics that you're seeing in a sort of a dashboard or in a table of data, right? They need to have that knowledge that expert's going to have to be able to interpret, are you presenting in a way that's understandable?
Yeah, I agree so much with that. It's very true. I've spent most of my career in the latter part with the people that have the niche needs, and I just find it so interesting because you cannot assume anything.
Yeah.
And that's a big part of our job is, yeah, there's hypotheses, a lot of stakeholders, a lot of times we'll have hypotheses, and we can test those out, right? But you don't know until you ask them. And another interesting thing in that space is they will say one thing, but then behave another way.
Yeah.
And so observation becomes very, very important to your point on field studies in that space. Whereas in general public, we can look at behavioral metrics across the internet. We can look at reports from Forrester, Gartner, other like very research intensive, and just kind of use the information that is already there. But when you have those niche users, you have to 100% do the research yourself,
Yeah.
which I think is the cool part. But yeah, it's so interesting because, right, it's their job, their daily job, what they're used to, and they're just trying to get jobs done. There's a framework called jobs to be done that is often in this space, and it's you're just learning, what are they trying to accomplish, what metrics are they having to meet as their job as an employee, and like how can we help with that. But yeah, sometimes I don't know, in just like healthcare is generally pretty far behind in technology, and so you'll see employees, they're just so used to terrible systems and they're really slow. And so they'll be doing something, they have all these crazy workarounds, and they're like, meh, this is fine. It's like, I just watched you do all this craziness. But to them, they're so used to terrible systems that it changes their perspective, right? So someone out in general public would be like, oh, the system's slow, I'm never going to use it. Well, they have to use it because it's their job. And so it changes their perspective. And observation is just so, so important in that. But one other thing I wanted to add, a little bit related, not quite, was we hit it on a bit that people in UX, and yeah, I also call it CX, customer experience. I feel like it's exploded into that space, but we all come from different backgrounds, and that's really the beauty of it. It's such a multidisciplinary field, and that is almost required for our jobs to be good as you're working with other people. And being one single UXer in one place is very difficult because you're having to check all your own biases, which if you've taken anthropology courses, you know that's not good. And so it's always good to have a group of people. And then it's very common to have someone from a technology background like myself, someone from the anthropology background. I've worked with someone with the art therapy, so psychology background, and she's really good at synthesizing research because of that skill. So everyone has these different skill sets that come together. And so I just wanted to add that that contributes to being able to observe correctly and make sure you're coming out with the right insights, and having multiple people viewing the same thing, hearing the same things, and we'll all pull different things from it. And then we pull that information together to really understand what's happening. So.
Yeah, there's a couple of points there. I think I agree with everything that Brittany is saying. I had an experience, we were on a military base in Germany. It was a British Air Force base, and we were getting some feedback on some of these wearable computer systems that we were designing. And I watched this guy working with these hardened sort of machines, right? So the sort of super bulky and durable. It was just a laptop, but they had a new pen, a stylus that they could interact with. And he was going on raving about how great this stylus was. And I was watching him do his work while he was talking to me. And like he kept tapping and missing the target, and like tapping and tapping and tapping, and take him like 10 taps to like hit the target. And like the stylus was not working. Like from an objective observation, not working. But he would like raving while it was not working, raving about how great it was. And maybe it was an improvement around sort of like all the sort of key commands and things that he had to do otherwise and sort of remember that, but it was still terrible. And so this idea of like, you can't just, we do a lot of interviewing, but you can't take people necessarily on sort of what they say. Being able to see what they actually do is super, super beneficial. And then the other point around different backgrounds, I think to do UX well, you really need to have other skill sets that you're bringing to the table, like you're saying, right? That you can collaborate and sort of get different viewpoints, because that's what it takes to do sort of innovative work a lot of times is looking at it from a different perspective, not just taking the assumptions that kind of have gotten us here already. So to that point, one of the first hire that I made when I was running my own studio, his undergrad was actually in dance performance. And he is like fully self-trained in terms of design and technology. And so we ended up, we spent a lot of time together in the studio, and he was telling me all about his sort of dance background. And we ended up, he told me this thing called Laban movement theory, Laban movement framework, which is sort of it's a framework to describe human movement, which is really interesting. We built a whole workshop around it to expose designers to this movement theory, where you actually having them move your bodies. And if you move your bodies in different ways, you have emotional reactions to that movement, right? And so we're applying this to, as we're building sort of more physical, tangible objects, right, that maybe have some sort of digital component to them, but understanding the physicality of these things that we're bringing into our lives and how does it move and interact is going to impact the emotional state of the people that are sort of in a relationship with these objects. And so I never would have done anything. We've been running this workshop off and on for like a decade, and it's been super amazing and fun for me. And I've incorporated some of that stuff into my work, and a lot of designers that have taken it have found it really valuable. But had I not collaborated with someone with a dance background, that type of connection would never have been made. And I think a lot of interaction design and user experience design, being able to sort of bring together a lot of these different backgrounds is super valuable. So not just having the skill set, right, but having a sort of broader understanding that you can sort of bring and apply. And I think that takes a level of understanding theory, not just like, I know how to do something, right? Like I know how to do an interview, I know how to process an interview, or, those sort of tactical skill sets are valuable and important, but understanding kind of the underlying theory of why you're doing what you're doing, or why the thing that you just did actually works, so that when something you sort of encounter a new situation, you know how to adapt, right? And you know how to sort of evolve your interviewing protocol, or maybe you need to do an activity instead of a straight interview because something's not working with the interview, or the participant isn't sort of exposing themselves, or they don't feel comfortable. You have to take a different approach to get the information you need. And so understanding the theory, I think, is really valuable in being able to then adapt your practice moving forward. Sorry, I know that went way away from where your original question was, but hopefully there's some value there.
All great information. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
So I'm very interested in pursuing UX design. However, I was wondering, what are the certificates or trainings required to be part of the market? Like you said, you did a bachelor that's not related to UX design, and did you pursue like a master? And was that enough to like equip you with like the skills needed to actually go straight into the market right after?
I have very strong opinions about this, but I'm also like 30 years removed from where you are. So I'll let you go first, and then I'll follow up if there's anything different.
Oh, I also have strong opinions. I wonder if they're similar. So yeah, it's interesting. UX design courses are starting to become a thing in universities. They're still really young and new, right? There's also, you'll find a lot of boot camps, they're called. They're 5-6 weeks, maybe 11 weeks, and they're supposed to be very immersive. They, in my opinion, this is my strong opinion, they are for profit. They're in the business of making money off you as designers, as researchers, because it's a hot field. They don't teach you they teach you tactical skills, but to Eric's point earlier, not the theory, not the ideas, not the curiosity, the multidisciplinary. You just can't get those in those boot camps. And they're like somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000. My opinion, not good. Don't do them. I'd love to hear Chris's way he's shaking his head, so I hope that's the same. But yeah, they're advertised everywhere. They're like, quick, get you into the UX field. And that's, I mentioned earlier when I was at Deloitte Digital, a lot of folks from boot camps fit well in those spaces because they really are just catering to the client. The client says, build this app for me. I want it to do this, this, and this. So they build an app that does that, that, and that. Do those features solve a customer problem? No idea. And so it's not really true UX design, in my opinion. So do you have to do an HCI degree? Also, no. I've worked with people very self-taught, and they're some of my most favorite people to work with because of that curiosity. They're like, really seeking the deepness, the what's the point of us being here? Because it's really challenging to work, especially in-house, and you fight against the stakeholders and the business people a lot, not like literally fight, but they see the world in a very different, business. They have to make money at the end of the day. We're all about solving people's problems, and sometimes those can conflict, and it's our job to basically tell those business folks, hey, like if you don't solve this customer's problem, you won't actually make that money that you want to make. If you solve the problem, you'll make the money. And it's like having a lot of conversations like that. So a lot of self-taught. There's tons of free courses on the internet. LinkedIn Learning is a good one, I think. There's all sorts of different ones, and maybe Eric will have some options better. IXDA that you mentioned, great resource. Yeah, there's.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, sorry, shouldn't have interrupted. Just like UXPA is another organization, and then there which is the user experience. It used to be UPA, which is usability. Anyway, history doesn't matter to you. But I think getting involved with groups, I know like there's probably not one in Danville, but there might be one in Lexington. I know several people in Louisville. We ran our conference for a year in Louisville in like 2015, 16. So I know that there's a strong community in Louisville. So I think one approach is try to engage some of these sort of professional communities of practice and get some advice there. I honestly don't know what the hiring is like for someone coming into the field initially, right? I agree about the boot camps. I think it's a waste of money. I think it'll get you some tactical skills. You might be able to get a job, but in the end, I think that job's going to be pretty shitty because you're going to be like at a big company, like stuck in a box doing one thing, and you're not probably going to have a lot of opportunity to sort of move around and learn and sort of grow. So that's one approach. I agree. You don't have to do a master's degree. It was a helpful pivot for me, but it's not necessary. I know people that teach in master's programs that don't have any sort of degree in this field. Granted, they're my age and older, so the world was different when they went through. But I think so. So yeah, online resources. I don't know off the top of my head. I think LinkedIn Learning. There's probably some others, but there's a lot of free stuff that you can get. Just sort of try to understand. Get connected with groups to sort of get some mentoring. I think that's hugely important. I'm trying to think what else, and then just do it. Like do the work, just practice, right? Like if you're taking these online courses, like think of a project that's interesting to you, and sort of just try it and sort of see what happens, and then you can sort of talk to those people in those groups if you can find a mentor or something that can give you some feedback, right? But it's a lot about just doing it and getting feedback, and so that then you can sort of have those conversations, even if you don't have the pedigree. You can at least sort of walk into an interview knowing how to talk and knowing the skills, and you've done some experience with that, and you might have some of the. I'm happy looking. I've reviewed thousands, maybe hundreds of portfolios over the years, and when I've hired people, and I don't really care about the degree they have. To me, it's always about how do they express themselves. Are they actually doing critical thinking as they're thinking through the whole thing, or are they making a bunch of assumptions, or are they challenging assumptions, and then they have a process to show me how they're going to learn and then make progress? And then how are they going to make something, and then how are they going to get feedback on it? How do they know that the thing that they made is good or successful, right? And so it's all about critical thinking and demonstrating those skills through the sort of portfolio process or the interview process. It's not necessarily about pedigree or anything like that. I would hire someone, and I did. The guy that was a dancer, when I met him, he was making templates for some shitty marketing company, and I was like, this guy knows more than he is expressing in the work that he's doing, because I could see his curiosity and I could see sort of his interest, and the questions he was asking were valuable questions. And so I think, it's like, I wish there were an easy answer, but it's really like to me those are the answers of what you need to do.
I completely agree. While you're talking, made me think of something too, is while you're looking for things online, we mentioned there's lots of free information. There's also lots of free misinformation.
Oh yeah.
On the UX field, boot camps being one of them. But so put on your researcher hat, even when you're looking at those, see what articles they're referencing. One of our big go-to absolute source of truth in UX is in NG, Nielsen Norman Group. So if they're referencing those, probably a better article. If there's no references, might not be great. See what community are they in. You can always, if someone's wrote a blog post like on Medium, for example, you can usually look them up somewhere online and Medium itself on LinkedIn, see what their background is, see if you can kind of gather if they're a real true UXer or not. It does take a little bit of work to digging, but you'll start to find the more you dig, you'll find the people. You'll find the ones who seem to know what they're talking about and see what they're referencing, see what they're suggesting, and kind of go from there.
Yeah, the other thing I'll recommend,
like us, will work too.
the other thing I'll recommend in terms of as an IXDA sort of alumni, there's like 15 years of IXDA conference talks. So every conference is like 40, 50 talks, keynotes to just like 10-minute talks, 20-minute talks, hour-long talks. They've all been recorded for like the last 15 years. They're on the Vimeo channel. Just look up IXDA Vimeo, and you should be able to find the account. Or Interaction is the name of the conference. So IXDA Interaction videos, and you should be able to find the account. But again, there's like 15, 20 years of those types of videos. Some will be irrelevant to you, but there's a lot of really amazing work that sort of, because a lot of them are theoretically based as well as practical, it doesn't sort of go out of date. So even some of the older talks are still relevant. Whereas some technology type talks, because technology is constantly changing, sometimes those become less relevant or they become outdated. But a lot of the interaction design talks are still relevant even 20 years later.
Oh, and if you're a book reader, some very basic intro books. There's one called The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman, I think is his last name.
Yep.
It's written in the 80s, I'm pretty sure, and it's phenomenal. It really makes you think in that way. It's not really diving into digital technology, it's more in the theory. So I highly recommend that one. And I'm sure if you get on Amazon and see that one, you'll see all the similar ones. There's a book, Don't Make Me Think, but that one gets a little outdated because it does talk about the technology. But yeah, you can bounce around for those too if that's your preference of learning. So.
Yep, totally.
We've got a couple more minutes, maybe time for one more quick question. Anything else you're curious about? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, so my name is Kelly. I'm also majoring in anthropology and sociology. So I was wondering, in what ways has getting a graduate degree in HCI has helped you, and in what ways has it really not been that necessary for your career?
I had a hard time hearing that question. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, it's okay.
My question was, how has getting a graduate degree in HCI helped you, and in what ways has it not really been necessary for you?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I'll try to answer this quickly. So it allowed me to be able to transition all of my anthro theory and practice into how might I be able to apply this, right? And so one, it gave me a space, 2 years, to sort of practice all of this stuff that I knew in terms of anthro practice, theory and practice, and sort of how can I apply this to the commercial world and actual sort of product design. So for me, that was a helpful transition. And when I made that transition, there wasn't all these free online resources and there wasn't all this stuff, right? We had to explain to clients, what's the value of this work that you don't have to do as much anymore. So for me, that was the value, was being able to sort of take the time to sort of understand how do I transition all this theory and practice of anthro work to how does that apply in a commercial setting? And the other things that are sort of associated with that, right? Some of the design work and some technology. I didn't have a really strong technology background when I got into this.
And I'll answer quickly too. Mine was the flip-flop, coming from the technology background. I took psychology at Center. I took anthropology. My husband also went to Center, graduated in anthropology, so I always had him helping too. But yeah, so it helped me learn how to take all the technology skills and apply those. So even though I had all the courses and knowledge, it just helped me kind of bring it all together. How do I really use psychology and computer science? And then, so I wouldn't say that there was anything that wasn't valuable out of it. I agree. It's just that there wasn't a lot of other options at the time and a lot of other free things. So that's why I say it's not required now. Back in the day, it might have been a little bit more, but not so much. So it's kind of to each your own. If you want a really intense immersive theory, then great. If you like want to go and learn, if you're more of a hands-on learner, then you might want to just kind of jump in and start trying things. Oh, there was one other thing I was going to mention about an industry, but I'm now forgetting. Oh well, sorry.
Thank you both for coming today and speaking to our students. I know they're really appreciated it.
Thanks for having us, and let us know. I'm open to receiving questions via email. I'm on LinkedIn as well. So if you want to connect through to Center back to me, I'm sure they can help figure that out. Yeah.
Yeah, same, totally.
All right, appreciate you both. Thank you.